The intersection of Fifth Avenue and Maple Street was one of the busiest places in the city. Every morning, thousands of people rushed past the corner. Businessmen in expensive suits, students with backpacks, mothers pushing strollers. This particular Tuesday morning was no different. The cold November wind scattered dead leaves across the sidewalk, and the city seemed determined to ignore the old man sitting on the concrete bench. His name was James Bernard, though no one had called him that in more than a decade. His clothes hung loose on his thin frame, dirty and worn from sleeping in shelters and abandoned buildings. His gray beard was matted, and his shoes had holes in the soles. To the passing crowds, he was invisible, just another homeless person occupying valuable sidewalk space. People stepped around him as if he were a piece of trash, their eyes deliberately avoiding his desperate gaze. James had been sitting in the same spot for 3 hours that morning, watching the world move past him. His hands trembled from the cold, and his mind felt foggy from the medications he could no longer afford to take regularly. He clutched a crumpled plastic bag containing everything he owned, a change of clothes, a dog-eared notebook, and a photograph so faded that the faces were barely visible anymore. A young woman nearly tripped over his outstretched legs and cursed at him without looking down. An older businessman tossed a penny near him, never breaking his phone conversation. The message was clear: he didn't matter. He was forgotten, discarded, and utterly alone in a city of millions. What James didn't know was that his name and face were worth billions of dollars. Somewhere in a corporate headquarters across town, his signature was attached to patents and inventions worth astronomical amounts. Decades ago, before life had torn him apart, James Bernard had been one of the most brilliant engineers in the country. He had designed systems that revolutionized the technology industry. But after a painful divorce, a series of poor business decisions, and a catastrophic stroke that no one had stood by him through, he had lost everything. His company had pushed him out. His family had abandoned him. His friends had disappeared. And eventually, so had his grip on reality and stability. By the time he recovered from the stroke, he had nothing left: no savings, no home, no one to call. Years of homelessness had stolen his dignity and his will to fight back. Now, at 73 years old, James Bernard was simply waiting for the end. He had no purpose, no future, and no reason to believe that anything would ever change. The morning wore on, and James huddled deeper into his thin jacket. His stomach hurt from hunger, and his throat was dry. People continued to stream past him, some hurrying, some walking slowly while staring at their phones. A woman dropped a dollar bill near him, more out of habit than compassion, and he didn't even bend over to pick it up. He had stopped fighting long ago. That was when he heard the young voice. It wasn't harsh or dismissive like most of the sounds directed at him. It was clear, kind, and somehow familiar to his ears in a way he couldn't quite explain. Through his clouded vision and the fog of despair that had become his constant companion, James looked up. A young black teenager stood before him, maybe 17 or 18 years old, with intelligent eyes that showed genuine concern. The boy wore a school uniform and carried textbooks, but what struck James most was the way the teenager was actually seeing him, really seeing him, not looking through him like everyone else did. "Hey, old man," the boy said softly, kneeling down to meet James at eye level. "Are you all right? Do you need help?" In that single moment, something shifted in the universe. An invisible thread connected the forgotten billionaire to the compassionate teenager. Neither of them understood it yet, but fate had just placed them exactly where they needed to be. Everything that had happened before this moment had been leading to this intersection, this bench, and this encounter that would change both of their lives forever. Marcus Williams was not supposed to be on Fifth Avenue that Tuesday morning. He was supposed to be at school taking a chemistry test that he had studied for all week. But his mother had called him an hour earlier, asking him to pick up medicine from the pharmacy on his way to class because she had to work an early shift at the hospital. Marcus, being the reliable and responsible son he had always been, didn't complain. He had simply changed his plans and headed to the corner pharmacy, his textbook stuffed into his backpack. That decision, that one choice to be helpful to his mother, had placed him directly in front of James Bernard at the precise moment when the old man had reached the lowest point of his existence. Marcus was not a wealthy kid. His family lived in a modest apartment in the less privileged part of town. His mother worked 2 jobs, and his father had passed away when Marcus was only 8 years old. Money was always tight, and Marcus often went without things that other teenagers took for granted. But what his family lacked in material wealth, they made up for in compassion and character. Marcus sat down on the bench next to James without hesitation. He didn't gag at the smell or make disgusted faces. Instead, he pulled the sandwich his mother had packed for his lunch out of his backpack and offered it to the old man. You look like you could use this more than me, Marcus said with a gentle smile. I can grab something from the school cafeteria later. James stared at the sandwich in disbelief. When was the last time someone had done something kind for him? Months? Years? He took the sandwich with shaking hands, and the simple act of accepting help brought tears to his weathered face. Marcus didn't try to make conversation or ask intrusive questions. He simply sat there, a quiet, steady presence beside the forgotten man. I'm Marcus, the boy said after a few minutes of companionable silence. What's your name? James, the old man replied hoarsely. James Bernard. Something about the name seemed to trigger a faint bell in Marcus's memory, but he couldn't quite place it. His history teacher had mentioned that name once in class when discussing important technological innovations. But surely it was just a coincidence. How could this homeless man possibly be connected to someone important? As they sat together, Marcus asked gentle questions and listened without judgment. He learned that James had been an engineer, that he had once been married, that he loved classical music and old books. James shared fragments of his life in halting, painful words, surprised at how easily the words came once he started speaking to someone who actually cared. For the first time in years, James felt like a human being again, not a shadow or a burden. When Marcus finally had to leave to get to school, albeit terribly late, he did something that surprised both of them. He asked for James's phone number so he could find him again. James laughed bitterly. I don't have a phone, son. I don't have anything. Marcus thought for a moment, then told James to wait at that same bench every day at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I'll find you, he promised. Why would you do that? James asked, unable to understand such genuine kindness. You don't know me. You owe me nothing. Marcus smiled, and his answer was simple and profound, because you matter. Everyone matters. After Marcus left, James sat with those words echoing in his mind. Someone had seen him. Someone had looked past the dirt and the rags and the failed life, and they had chosen to help anyway. It was a small act of kindness, but to James, it was everything. That afternoon, when he didn't show up at the bench, it wasn't because he didn't want to be there. It was because he was sick, feverish, and had to spend the night in the emergency room at the city hospital. But Marcus was determined. He had to find this old man again. The next morning, Marcus arrived at the bench before school with a thermos of hot coffee and a bag of breakfast sandwiches. When he didn't find James there, panic seized his chest. The old man had said he would be there. Marcus told himself that James had probably just slept in or found shelter somewhere else. But worry gnawed at him throughout the entire school day. During lunch, instead of eating, Marcus visited the local shelters and emergency rooms, asking if they had admitted an elderly homeless man named James Bernard. At St. Mary's Hospital, the receptionist checked the overnight admissions and found him. James had been brought in by paramedics at around midnight, suffering from pneumonia and a high fever. He was admitted to the respiratory unit, barely conscious and fighting for each labored breath. Marcus felt his heart sink. He immediately decided to go to the hospital after school, consequences be damned. When Marcus finally found James's room on the 3rd floor, his breath caught. The old man looked smaller in the hospital bed, diminished by illness and suffering. Tubes ran from his arm and oxygen tubes were positioned under his nose. But when James saw Marcus standing in the doorway, something magical happened. His eyes brightened, and a weak smile crossed his face. You came, James whispered. Of course I came, Marcus replied, pulling a chair close to the bed. He sat there for hours, after school and into the evening, talking to James about everything and nothing. Marcus told him about his dreams of studying engineering and physics. He talked about his mother, his favorite books, and his fears about college and the future. James listened with an intensity that made Marcus feel like every word he said was precious and important. On the 2nd day of James's hospital stay, a doctor informed him that he would need extended care and rehabilitation. The hospital couldn't release him back to the streets, he would have likely died within weeks. There were discussions about long-term care facilities and social services. James, who had spent so many years being processed through the system without anyone truly advocating for him, suddenly had someone in his corner. Marcus started researching. He spent hours in the school library and on his grandmother's computer, looking into the history of technological patents and innovations from the 80s and 90s. When he finally found it, a biography of James Bernard, the visionary engineer who had designed revolutionary communication systems, his blood went cold. The photograph in the article was unmistakable, even though the man in the picture was healthier, younger, and dressed in an expensive suit. It was the same face, aged by hardship but distinctly recognizable. Marcus's hands trembled as he read the story. James Bernard had been forced out of his company after a stroke had temporarily affected his cognitive functions. There had been a legal battle, dirty business tactics, and eventually, his complete disappearance from public record. The article was from 15 years ago. The technology that James had helped develop had gone on to generate billions of dollars for his former company. James had received nothing. Marcus didn't immediately confront James with this information. Instead, he did something far more important. He called a lawyer. He wasn't sure exactly what he was doing, but he knew that this couldn't be right. The law firm he contacted, after initially dismissing the call from a teenager, became very interested when Marcus mentioned James Bernard's name. They promised to look into the matter immediately. Within days, the hospital staff's attitude toward James changed dramatically. Suddenly, he was receiving better care, and discussions were happening about his future placement. The turning point came when a distinguished attorney named Patricia Chen appeared at James's bedside with documents that would change everything forever. Patricia Chen was a specialty attorney who handled intellectual property rights and corporate misconduct cases. She had made her name fighting for inventors and innovators who had been robbed of their due compensation. When Marcus had told her James's story over the phone, even though she had initially thought it was a prank, something in her instincts had told her to look deeper. What she discovered was a decades-old injustice that had been quietly buried. James Bernard had indeed designed the core systems that had made his former company billions of dollars. But when he suffered the stroke and needed recovery time, the board of directors saw an opportunity. They had maneuvered him out of his position, convinced him that his cognitive abilities were too impaired for him to continue, and bought out his shares at a fraction of their actual value. They had claimed he had signed away his rights to future profits from his patents. What they hadn't counted on was that those documents might have been forged or obtained under duress. Patricia had researched the case meticulously. She had interviewed former employees, reviewed old business records, and discovered that the documents were indeed fraudulent. More than that, she had found proof that James's medical condition had been used as a pretext to rob him of his legacy. The company had been making billions from his technology while he lived on the streets. "Mr. Bernard," Patricia said, spreading documents across his hospital bed table, "you've been the victim of one of the most egregious corporate frauds I've ever encountered. And I believe we have a case that could recover a significant portion of what was stolen from you." James, still recovering but growing stronger each day, stared at the documents in confusion. Marcus sat beside him, squeezing his shoulder in support. The reality of what had happened was almost too much to comprehend. James had spent years thinking he was worthless, that he had failed, that he deserved his fate. Now, Patricia was telling him that he had been deliberately destroyed by people he had once called friends and partners. "What does this mean?" James asked weakly. "It means," Patricia explained with fierce determination, "that we sue your former company for everything they owe you. Based on the profits they've generated from your patents over the past few decades, we're looking at a settlement in the range of $2 to $3 billion. Possibly more." James felt the room spin. Billions. The word seemed impossible, fictional, belonging to someone else's life. He looked at Marcus, and tears streamed down both their faces, James's tears of overwhelming emotion and gratitude, and Marcus's tears of joy for this man who had shown him kindness when everyone else had looked away. The legal battle that followed captured media attention. News outlets ran stories about the brilliant engineer who had been discarded by his company, the homeless man who had been invisible for years, and the teenage boy whose simple act of compassion had uncovered one of the biggest corporate frauds in recent history. The company fought viciously, with their teams of expensive lawyers trying every tactic to discredit James and minimize their liability. But Patricia was relentless. She presented evidence of forged documents, witness testimonies, and a mountain of proof that the company had knowingly stolen from James. The case went to trial, played out in newspapers and on television news programs. Public opinion was overwhelmingly on James's side. People were outraged that a man had been discarded so thoroughly, that his brilliance had been stolen, and that he had suffered years of homelessness because of corporate greed. After 8 months of litigation, the company settled. They agreed to pay James Bernard $3 billion in compensation for stolen patents, lost revenues, and emotional damages. There were gasps in the courtroom when the settlement was announced. James, who had been trying not to faint from the stress of the trial, heard the number and felt like he was dreaming. But even as the legal victory was being celebrated, James knew the real victory had already happened. It wasn't the money. It was the fact that someone had seen him and had cared. Marcus had given him something money could never buy, his humanity back. 6 months after the settlement was finalized, James Bernard stood in the lobby of a brand new research center bearing his name, the Bernard Institute of Advanced Technology. It was built in an underprivileged neighborhood of the city, designed to provide free education and mentorship to young people who wanted to study engineering and science but couldn't afford fancy schools. The grand opening ceremony was filled with media, city officials, and important figures from the technology industry. But the person James was most proud to see was Marcus Williams, who stood at his side, dressed in a sharp navy suit that James had insisted on buying him. Marcus was now officially a scholarship student at the city's top university, studying mechanical engineering with the full support of James's foundation. The two had become inseparable over the past year, a bond forged in those early moments when Marcus had simply treated a homeless man like a human being. "I still can't believe this is real," James said, placing a proud hand on Marcus's shoulder as they surveyed the beautiful facility they had created together. "You built this with your mind," Marcus replied, "and I helped you rebuild your life with your heart. That's how it works in real life, we need both." James had reclaimed his health and his dignity. He had moved into a comfortable apartment, gotten proper medical care for his chronic conditions, and reconnected with the few family members who were ashamed of how they had treated him. He had paid off Marcus's mother's mortgage, ensuring she would never have to work 2 jobs again. He had donated millions to homeless shelters and mental health facilities. He had used his wealth not to isolate himself but to invest in others. The Bernard Institute had already transformed hundreds of young lives. It offered scholarships, internships, and mentorship programs to kids like Marcus, brilliant minds from struggling backgrounds who deserved opportunities. Every single student who walked through those doors knew the story of James Bernard, the forgotten billionaire who had been rescued by kindness. It served as a powerful reminder that everyone has value, regardless of their circumstances. On the evening of the grand opening, James and Marcus sat on the roof of the new building, looking out over the city skyline. The November wind was cool but gentle, and the city lights twinkled like diamonds. "Do you remember that day?" Marcus asked. "When I first sat down next to you on that bench?" "Every moment of it," James replied. "It was the day my life began again. I had given up. I was ready to die invisible. And then you saw me." "The world is full of people who overlook someone like you every single day," Marcus said thoughtfully. "We see homeless people, and we look the other way. We assume they're not worth our time or attention. I don't know why I didn't do that. Maybe it was my mom's influence. Maybe it was just luck." "It wasn't luck," James said firmly. "It was character. It was empathy. It was the choice to see the humanity in someone society had discarded. That's something you choose every single day, Marcus. And because you made that choice, you've changed the world. Not just for me, but for everyone who will walk through these doors and get a second chance." James reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a key, a real key made of solid gold. "This is the key to my original apartment when I was young," he explained. "I found it after I got settled. I kept it all these years in a storage unit, a reminder of better times. I want you to have it. Not as a trophy or a memory, but as a symbol. A key opens doors. And you opened every door I thought was closed forever." Marcus took the key with trembling hands, understanding the profound meaning behind the gesture. This wasn't just about gratitude. It was about legacy, about passing on the understanding that one person's kindness can literally change the trajectory of someone else's entire life. As they sat together under the stars, both men reflected on how dramatically their lives had changed in just 1 year. James had gone from invisible and hopeless to celebrated and purposeful. Marcus had gone from being an ordinary teenager trying to help his struggling family to being the catalyst for one of the most inspiring stories in the nation. But neither of them thought of themselves as extraordinary. They had simply done what they believed was right. The next morning, James received a call from a journalist who wanted to do a follow-up story about his transformation. He politely declined. The story wasn't about him becoming wealthy. It was about what had been there all along: 2 human beings seeing each other, recognizing the inherent worth in each other, and choosing kindness. As James hung up the phone, he looked out his window at the city below. Somewhere out there, countless elderly people were sitting on benches, being ignored by the masses rushing past. Somewhere out there, teenagers were making choices about whether to show compassion or turn away. James had learned that one moment of genuine care could matter more than all the money in the world. He and Marcus had already started planning their next venture, a mentorship program that would pair homeless individuals with young people, allowing both to teach each other and to heal together. Because James understood now that being seen and valued wasn't a luxury reserved for the wealthy or successful. It was a human necessity. Everyone deserved to matter. The forgotten billionaire had been found not by his wealth returning, but by being truly seen by someone who cared. And in the process, he had found his purpose and his peace.